This is the stuff that I'm saying later in the video, but I'm putting this clip at the opening to foreshadow something, and you'll never guess what. Foreshadowing is really straightforward. It's as easy as 1, 2, 3. But the best foreshadowing has a dirty little secret. A secret that destroys the very notion of foreshadowing entirely and also amplifies it in a sort of paradoxical way. If your story is good enough, if you tick all the boxes related to great characters and plot, then you shouldn't need to foreshadow at all. At least not intentionally. But also at the same time, if you do this correctly, everything will sort of become foreshadowing. Let's start with a definition. Foreshadowing is any element early in a story that hints at events later on in the story. Sort of a clue that gets left for the reader. This clue may not be, and often isn't apparent as a clue early in the story. The salience of a piece of foreshadowing usually doesn't present itself right away, but to be effective, it should draw the reader's attention in some way. Sometimes what seems like a foreshadowing element is actually not a foreshadowing element. This is the good old red herring, a smelly piece of fish that's meant to draw attention away from the actual important fish of a story, I guess. A foreshadowing element can be almost anything. Could be a character casually mentioning they've never had a Spanish omelet in dialogue, could be a muddy footprint on the carpet in the lounge, could be a large piano hanging by a small chain. Foreshadowing is an important element of creating expectations in the reader, and expectations are a major part of getting a reader through a story. Good stories are predictable in a sense. What the reader is getting out of the story needs to be clear. If you set up a murder that needs to be solved in chapter 1, but the entire story centers around the romance between our detective and that cute blood spatter analyst who just transferred into the precinct, then that's a problem. You're setting up a mystery, that's what the reader is expecting the story to deliver, but instead you're delivering a romance. Now that story could work so long as reader expectations are properly managed. I don't think any story necessarily has a bad ending, just an ending that's poorly served by its beginning. I think any ending to a story can work, provided the beginning sets it up properly. This idea around expectations and setting things up applies to things like tone, it applies to characterization, it applies to the setting information. If you've got sci-fi technology or fantasy magic, it applies there as well. Foreshadowing gives the reader hints at how the story is going to play out, what elements are important, and how the rules of the world work. It gives them an idea of what to expect later on. They may not necessarily know the details, but they know the general direction. We tend to talk about foreshadowing in discrete terms, like this thing here is meant to foreshadow something later on. But if you think about it, any effect later on in the story should be caused by a cause earlier in the story. This gets to the main point of the video. Foreshadowing, when done at its best, is not a deliberate activity, but rather just an emergent property of well-written characters and plot. If you have good plot and good characters, there should be a cause and effect relationship between the events in the story, which means that just writing about your characters and plot should serve to properly foreshadow everything coming later on. The villain turning to the side of good in chapter 40 because they were written as the type of character who has the potential to turn from evil to good. It just makes sense for the character to do this because that's who they are. In this way, everything in your story is arguably foreshadowing because if you have a tight plot and characters that fit well, there's an unbroken chain of cause and effect through every event in the story. Randomness and unpredictability only exist in a vacuum of information. Good characterization, good exposition, and good description all give the reader lots of information, which allows them to make predictions. And if you've done everything correctly, those predictions should be pretty much accurate because your story should follow a logical chain of cause and effect. Now, there is definitely a place for deliberate foreshadowing, and the best moments of foreshadowing are often dropped in their little artful hints that the author has put in intentionally. In Abercrombie's Best Served Cold, there's a character who offhandedly mentions that getting through this thing with both of their eyes would be a preferable way to go about things. And well, it's an Abercrombie novel, so I can't describe what happens on YouTube, but you kind of get the idea. That's the kind of detail that's unlikely to just organically occur because of the characterization and the world. That's something that the author deliberately puts in to foreshadow an event later on. There's nothing wrong with that, but you should have to do less of this intentional foreshadowing if you've got characters and plot that work out in a logical way. I think where foreshadowing becomes problematic is when these hints are used to compensate for characters who don't fit or a plot that feels too contrived. Take something like a redemption arc where a villain turns from bad to good. That's the kind of thing that requires a lot of setup. The sort of villain you write for a redemption arc is very different from just a general standard issue villain. If you take a villain that's not designed to go through a redemption arc and try to ram them through a redemption arc, it's not going to work. The reader won't like it. Compensating for that by throwing in some lazy foreshadowing elements, like some quippy dialogue or some random character thoughts, or a scene that is meant to foreshadow it but just seems really out of place, that probably won't be enough to compensate for the underlying weakness in the character and the arc you're trying to put them through. Well-written characters will create natural expectations so long as they are paired with a plot that makes sense for them, rather than trying to compensate with foreshadowing to try and set up an ending in a better way. This often means delving deeper into character goals and motivations. These should be the things that drive the plot. Your plot should be built around the characters trying to get what they want, and they should have legitimate reasons for wanting those things. They should take actions that they are likely to take in pursuit of those things, rather than just having characters who exist to make sure that a fight scene happens at the end of chapter 6. Foreshadowing, when it naturally arises out of your story, is great. That's the best kind of foreshadowing. You should consider deliberate foreshadowing as a way to enhance this, not compensate for a lack of it. So I guess the secret to great foreshadowing is just to write a good story and it will sort of naturally happen. Boy, I did not see that conclusion. Speaking of things you didn't see, you're about to not see this video anymore because it's at the end. That didn't really work. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you think about this in the comments down below. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.